Good morning. My name is Che, and I am Mozilla Foundation's Special Advisor on Africa Innovation Muradi, where I support the work that Mozilla is doing in terms of developing its work around the Africa innovation space, as well as support the work around our Common Voice African Languages project, where we have, as of this year, launched a focus on Common Voice for the East African region. In terms of some of the frameworks around ethical AI, there are quite a lot that have emerged over the last couple of years in terms of the conversations. The people who are leading these conversations are often within policy research institutions, the developers themselves, or intergovernmental organizations or multilateral organizations such as UNESCO. So some of the frameworks that we've documented in our work around trustworthy AI in our white paper reference the ethics principles that have been laid out by Australia, for example, which provides about 8 AI ethical principles that are meant to be voluntary, inspirational, and intended to complement any AI regulations. Again, in 2020, Singapore actually launched an updated version of its model AI governance, which lays out the government's mature vision for using data and AI responsibly. And then thinking specifically around the African continent, last year, UNESCO had a couple of consultations with very different stakeholders in order to develop ethical principles for the African continent, which were relevant and which would take into account the issues that we face when we're dealing with ethics. Because one of the criticisms is often that we don't want to just transplant what has been developed in regions such as Australia and Singapore that I've mentioned, but actually want to convene different stakeholders to have ethical principles that are responsive to our context and take into account some of our own regional charters, such as the African Charter on Human Rights and Principles. So yeah, so that's sort of like a summary of the kind of ethical principles that are in existence. What Africa should focus on when developing AI tech and regulation is inclusivity. So in this point, what I'm basically nuancing is that we need to take into account the diversity of the continent so that we ensure that everyone has the opportunity to shape innovation and is part of the process of designing the tech and the regulation and is not just simply a consumer of knowledge. Then secondly, we need to ensure that we're building technology that's responsive to our issues and fosters also creativity, because it's important to recognize that the continent has vast talent and it can be leveraged for solving problems, but as well as, developing tools that are for entertainment. Because when we think about some of the platforms that we are currently all connecting on, such as social media platforms, they really were designed for entertainment, and then we've built up on them to be able to solve our own problems. And then thirdly, transparency is key. So in developing AI technologies, it's important that we take into account transparency as a pathway to accountability, right? So what we recognize is that companies don't often provide transparency into how their AI systems work, which then impairs the legal and technical mechanisms for accountability. And when we think about transparency, what we're actually saying is that it has different use cases for different audiences, which then highlights the point of the need for these spaces to also be multidisciplinary in terms of who's actually engaging on the conversations. So we find that for developers, for example, they want transparency as a means to clarify how technical decisions were made for the design as well as development of the machine learning model. To end users, transparency is about conveying the most important points to a broad audience, presenting accessible summaries of what the model is doing, right? And then for watchdogs and policymakers and people interested in regulation, it's also meaningful. It's also a way in which to understand how the technology was designed, what are the issues that are taken into account for discrimination, how it has an impact on society in the way that it's being implemented. So when you're thinking about those points, it's then important to ensure that the model of transparency actually ties into the inclusivity and responsiveness that we are arguing for. And then lastly, I think it's important for there to be an ideal around agency, right? So that it's relevant to the continent, that it's timely and context driven, because then this can have direct links for the benefit or protection around like data and data governance, and then also really connected to the national and regional continental enforcement of such policies, so that there's a connection in everything that we're doing and it's not just unique to a particular region. And yeah, so I think those are should be the focus when designing AI tech and regulation.
Yes, so hello, my name is Serena Oduro, and I'm the Technology Equity Fellow at the Greenlighting Institute, which is a policy and research institute based in Oakland, California, that focuses on creating economic opportunities for communities of color. And I specifically focus on issues of tech that relate to economic opportunity. So we particularly focus on the digital divide, so broadband access, then also algorithmic equity. So how like algorithmic bias through AI can harm economic opportunity for communities of color. Yes, so when it comes to AI regulation, what it looks like in the US, currently, I mean, there's a lot of legislation that's trying to be passed to lead to some sort of AI regulation. Currently, most regulators, and just in the US, we don't really have too much frameworks. You have some rising calls for data protection, such as like the creation of California's Privacy Protection Agency, but we're currently on the federal level also trying to get something started. AI regulation, so that's for the US. I can't speak to the UK specifically, but in the EU, I think due to a lot of the big tech companies that have been really influencing the world have been more American or non-EU based, the EU has seen regulation as an opportunity to really share their vision for what AI should look like and just data-centric technologies. In addition to hopefully with regulation, it seems to me that their hope is that that can also increase the amount of EU-based tech companies that can compete within those domains. So within the EU, you've seen like general data protection regulations. They have a new EU AI proposal, which is to create kind of a high-risk framework for which type of AI need to be regulated at a higher level, requiring impact assessments, requiring looks at how it impacts people's rights. And so we're trying to kind of mirror that in the US through, in California, Greenlighting is sponsoring AB 13, which is the Automated Decision Systems Accountability Act of 2021. And that's supposed to require impact assessments for whenever Californian public sector procure any AI from a contractor. So during the bidding process, normally they only consider fairness and price, but we want them to also consider when public sector agencies are procuring algorithms to also consider bias and also the efficiency of the algorithmic system, because it's easy to not see without impact assessment. So that's kind of what it looks like. In the US, I think it's a bit more patchwork, and it'd be great to me if we could build a framework like the EU, but I really want to focus on its impacts on people of color. So yeah, I think something that African countries can maybe learn just from looking at this US perspective is some of the legal barriers that have prevented effective AI regulation, such as the nature of our anti-discrimination law being based in human intent and also tending to be pretty individualistic. A lot of times the history of US anti-discrimination law has kind of been moved forward by white folks being like, I don't want to be discriminated against, etc. And so something to me that could be really important for, African countries and people to really like look at is, knowing the kind of the Western background of anti-discrimination law in general, and also technology that tends to be way more focused on benefiting those in power. Like, how could that be done differently in Africa? Especially because an AI regulation or ethics matches the interest of either a corporation or a government does not necessarily mean that it matches the interests of the people. And that's something that I've been really focusing on here. And I feel like it's been hard to find frameworks that really censor that, because that's just not like who's kind of in power and influencing what's happening in AI regulation and, inventing frameworks or different statistical approaches, et cetera. So I think that could be a really central consideration in an African context. And like one person I really appreciate their work, Isabella Mwambi. He wrote a report just talking about how Ubuntu, which is an African philosophical concept, could be used in AI ethics for a better kind of framework that's not rooted in the individual and also just kind of within a history of white supremacy and colonialism, but that's more rooted in the people and our social connections. So to me, I saw that as, okay, if we actually leaned into what various African philosophies can bring to the table, caring about the people and maybe challenging current legal norms within the US and the West that are more individualist focused. I think African perspectives, amongst many other things, would bring a lot of great frameworks and opportunities that wouldn't not only be useful in Africa, but I'd hope to implement it in the US too. So I'm kind of looking to Africa to maybe give some inspiration for what could be done in the US, because there's so many challenges to effective and I think really equitable regulation.
My name is Jaja Pia. I am the Executive Director for Ghana Tech Lab and also the co-founder and CEO for Kumasi Hive, which is a tech innovation hub. Well, AI regulations in Africa, I think currently it is quite at its early stage across the continent. Talking about Africa, being particular about that, there is not so much being done around it, maybe apart from maybe around South Africa and maybe some of the northern African countries. But majority of African countries don't have very maybe laid down AI policy or AI regulation as compared to maybe other things like which has catch on like blockchain, where we have government moving in directly on. Here in Ghana, we don't have anything directly as such. What people do have is actually maybe data protection or data related regulation or policy, but not so much can be said about AI. So the challenge from what I've seen would be lack of stakeholder consultation that will lead to very difficulties and much difficulties in its implementation of such regulation if they come to be. Well, I think in building a trustworthy AI system, African government and AI policy or regulators will need to ensure that we really have a lot of data sets that speak to the needs of Africans and bring about a lot of inclusivity, because one of the biggest challenges is having data sets to work with and to build AI models and one other things and build a solution particularly for Africa. So for me, it will be that we need to put in measures that allow tailored solutions built on AI to develop here on the continent. Also something that also have in mind, let's say issues around privacy and data protection are all integrated. I think these are the key things to consider.
My name is Shamira Ahmed. I am a senior researcher economist at Research ICT Africa, which is a think tank in Cape Town, South Africa. I would say that the meaning of gender bias in artificial intelligence, it usually depends on the use case, but generally gender bias creeps up because of data limitations, badly designed algorithms, and the lack of gender diversity in workforces where AI-based systems are used or deployed. So essentially, because AI is not neutral and is often prone to biases and adopting biases that exist in whatever ecosystem it is deployed in, it has the potential to amplify these existing systemic biases and discrimination. So that is a good question, and there is no simple answer. But generally, I think the best solution to rein in the risk of AI perpetuating gender bias or stereotypes would ensure that the workplaces where AI-based systems and products are developed are more diverse and have a work culture that encourage women as product leads or data scientists. And they also have a culture where women's voices are heard in developing AI-based solutions. But given that there is already a gender segregation in AI talent and STEM skills, this might be difficult and requires input from different actors and different overlapping priorities. For example, there needs to be issues that are addressed in the education system, in the workplaces, in the private sector, and in the government. So it is quite complex. In terms of opportunities that AI gives with regards to gender balance, if deployed responsibly, AI can potentially eliminate the discrimination that arises from the use cases that highlight discrepancies due to biased credit loan officers. So it can counteract these biases and ensure that despite the limited information given by the credit officer, women are also given access to credit based on other characteristics, not simply human bias. And another way that AI-based systems have potential to lessen gender bias is in recruitment processes. For example, AI can be used to highlight biased recruiting behavior if it's trained on recruiting data in a test environment, for example, and it can ensure that instead of analyzing gender characteristics, experience, skill set, and other characteristics are highlighted to match employees with the job role.
So my name is Alfred Ongere. I run an initiative called AI Kenya, and I'm also the managing director of an organization called Mind Intelligence Limited. AI Kenya started in October 2017. In full, it is Artificial Intelligence Kenya, and it simply came out of a need to see a thriving ecosystem in artificial intelligence. And this was from both a technical and a non-technical sort of viewpoint of things. So the first initiative this first program that you are going to run under this initiative was creating a community that was bringing together like-minded people in machine learning and data science. So this ranges all the way from beginners, intermediates to experts in the field of machine learning to data science. So all the way from students, university students, to working professionals in the data and technology industry. So yeah, since October 2017, we've been holding different events, both technical and non-technical, to enable people to share knowledge and learn from each other, and also share opportunities that are in the space of AI. In terms of opportunities where we can apply AI or where we can use AI more in Kenya, I'd say there's so many. In terms of just any activity that we are generating, any data that can be harnessed in a digital form is a good opportunity for us to apply AI. So I would say in government, in things like identification of people, to give them to access to services, there's still a lot we can do there in terms of enabling people to use the identity they have, whether it's their fingerprint or their face. And of course, in such cases, you have the problem of people aging. So whether it's someone's fingerprint being altered or whether someone's face changes, you need a system that can automatically sort of adapt to that particular case and still identify the person. So there's lots of potential in using AI to address that. In agriculture, in helping us to not only predict, but monitor how we produce food and how also we consume food. There's a lot of opportunity there. In logistics, helping us to move around and allocate our resources. I think everyone knows the other day we just had a World Safari Rally happening in Naivasha, and there was a lot of traffic jam. So we could use technology to simulate and anticipate the demand of use of resources such as roads, and then plan accordingly to sort of mitigate that. And then in e-commerce, helping people to better identify and recommend products. But in order to do this, I would say the first thing is we need to encourage, we need to adopt a high standard of digitizing the processes on a day-to-day basis. And what this means is instead of focusing purely on where most of the time where we can apply AI or where we can apply technology, ensuring that we have the underlying, a strong underlying infrastructure in terms of people embracing a culture of interacting and trusting technology to help them in that day-to-day basis. From the academia side, I would say we need to create pipelines or resources that ensure we take or we turn most of the postgraduate or undergraduate research projects that people are undertaking in AI and then turn them into actual products and eventually into startups and eventually into companies that can employ people. So we see a lot of research students just really creating amazing products, amazing breakthroughs, and they're leveraging artificial intelligence. But the sad thing is we are not applying most of those solutions locally here because companies have either not understood the potential of the technology or they think that it is a very costly sort of venture to undertake, which is not the case. Then lastly, I'd say we need to embrace high standards towards becoming a data-driven economy or ecosystem. And that will really help us now to easily switch to adopting not only AI, but other advanced technologies.